Okay, welcome back. Today we have three more poems to look at. The first one is I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died by Emily Dickinson. Now, Emily Dickinson, very interesting character from the 19th century, one of the great American poets, a tremendous genius. But when she was writing poetry, she didn't write it for it to be published. In fact, during her lifetime, only a few poems were published. And so after her death, all of these poems were collected, and many poems, sometimes clusters written just, a few every few days. So a tremendous genius, but she didn't write poetry for it to be out there, but deep reflections on what she saw around her in Amherst, Massachusetts. She pretty much lived in her father's house almost her entire life, and towards the end of her life, she lived up in an upstairs bedroom and would not really allow any visitors in to see her. She didn't title any of her poems, so by convention, if a poem doesn't have a title, then the first line of the poem is the title. So that's why the title of this poem is I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. 591 simply means the order in which they think that this poem was written, but mostly it's a guess. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable, and then it was there interposed a fly, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. With Emily Dickinson, in her brilliance, you almost never believe or feel like you get to the bottom of her poetry. It's almost as if she's pointing to something beyond words, okay? But let's give it a try anyway. So this is a moment when a person is dying, and what is this person's mind attached to? A fly buzzing. Now, you've probably had the experience that you're in a quiet room, maybe you're trying to read, and there's a fly buzzing around, and it's very annoying, and it's distracting, isn't it? So at this moment of death, there's a fly buzzing around. And the stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. So it's almost like we're in the eye of a storm here, right? There's been a lot of, we're holding our breaths at this moment. There's a stillness in the air, just like in between heaves of storm. So there's a storm has already come, another storm is coming, and we're just kind of, there's stillness in the air. Okay, so we're at this very solemn moment, the death of a person. And I guess we fill it with dignity and with respect, and we are very much, we all know that we are going to have this moment in our lives too. And so we very much want to lend it as much dignity and respect as we can. There are other people in the room. The eyes around had wrung them dry. And so you know how eyes look when somebody's been crying for a while. Sometimes they look kind of dry, but you could tell when somebody's been crying. And the breaths were gathering firm. So people in the room are breathing shallowly or holding their breaths for that last onset, for the moment of death, from when that person finally slips away, when the king be witnessed in the room. Now, she doesn't make clear to us who the king is. We can safely say it's not Elvis, but who is the king that we're going to witness in the room? Is it death? Death is going to come, and death is ultimately the king, and we're going to witness death in the room as this person slips away. We're there for that moment of death. Is it God? Who is this king that we're going to witness in the room? Then there's a convention with Emily Dickinson because of the I she used, very personal poetry. Almost certainly she is not her own narrator, but by convention we refer to our narrator as a she, unless there's other reasons not to. I willed my keepsakes, so she had already decided who's going to get what, her possessions, signed away what portions of me be assignable. In other words, she already wrote her will, what portions of her she can give away. There's portions of us we don't give away. There's portions of us that, get buried. But those things of ours that we can give away, that we can assign to somebody, that's all been done. Okay, so her responsibilities are finished. She's taken care of her keepsake. She's willed away everything. She's done all she's supposed to do. And there's this moment of death. There's people in the room. It's almost like this quiet before the storm, and it's still, and we're waiting for the king. And who shows up? And then it was there interposed the fly. With blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Okay, so, one of the things that's really sort of interesting is almost, I don't want to quite call it a comical moment, but it certainly is sort of a letdown, right? It's almost as if we're in this room and we're all pretending not to hear this annoying fly, okay? And also, and not to be too gross about it, but if I were soon to be a corpse, I wouldn't want to be thinking there's a fly that's going to be interested in me, interested in landing on me and laying eggs or something. And so I can imagine this being disturbing to a person who's about to die. But more to the point, I think, it sort of is disrupting the dignity, the formality of the moment. And maybe it's meant to really sort of undermine sort of the dignity and formality of that moment. It's something we're all going to have to do. Dying is as common as birth, right? All of us who are born, our lives are going to end. And so perhaps in this moment, Emily Dickinson is saying, maybe we invested with too much formality or honor, because after all, death is very common. Now, in the final stanza, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz. Okay, so blue is an adjective, it's a color, but something is blue in that line, and what's blue in that line is the buzz. So I'm picturing sort of, sometimes flies have either like a little blue sort of shine or a green sort of shine. So the narrator hears the fly buzzing and sees the color blue, but interesting, the blue is modifying buzz. So a color is modifying a sound. Well, that's not supposed to happen. Colors don't modify sounds. And so I think what we're having going on here is almost as if her different senses, her sense of sight, her sense of sound, are sort of collapsing in on each other, but still between the light and me. And so I suppose her eyes are open and can kind of see the light coming through the window, and then the fly is sort of flying around, interposing, just can kind of make out that fly. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Well, of course, the windows didn't fail. It's her eyesight that's failing, right? The windows were windows. Light was coming through the windows. And then I could not see to see. So that means that she has slipped away. She has died. That her senses have failed her, and she has died. So I can imagine a moment when, perhaps in the afterlife, and perhaps this is what Emily Dickinson is sort of imagining too. It's almost as if people sitting around, well, how did you die? Or what happened when you died? And she answers the question with, well, there was this fly in the room, and I don't know, maybe it kind of spoiled the moment. But there's one thing this fly, and perhaps this is sort of the deeper truth about life. There's one thing this fly has that this dying person does not have, and that is a future. The flies may not live very long, but the fly has life. And this person is losing that life. And you might think, what is that spark? What is that thing that means the fly is alive? And what is that spark that the dying person loses? What is really the difference between the two? You would think, well, in a more just universe, the person wouldn't die, the fly would. But of course, that's not how it works. We all have a life to give to the universe. So if I were to explore the theme of this poem, I think I would lean towards thinking about the degree to which we invest such meaning, we invest such emotional power, we invest such honor and dignity and tradition and formality to this moment, a moment we're all going to go through in one way or another. And by having the fly sort of disrupted, having the fly kind of ruining the dignity of the moment, maybe she herself is sort of undermining the dignity, the formality with which we invest these moments. Okay, next up is Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Like the last poem, this is also a poem about death, but unlike Emily Dickinson's poem, this isn't about sort of passively letting death come, and even though a fly interrupts that moment, okay, is sort of just letting death come, arriving for her, and she just sort of slipping away at the end. Here, Dylan Thomas is going to make a case that we need to fight death. No death without a struggle, right? We're going to fight death tooth and nail when death comes for us. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men, who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So this poem actually takes the form of an argument, and it's only at the end that we find out who he is addressing the argument to. So the thesis really is, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. And he keeps referring to that almost like a refrain, either rage against the dying of the light or do not go gentle into that good night at the end of each stanza. So it's almost as if that's a refrain, or that's sort of restating his thesis, if you like. And it's in the form of an argument, because then he presents 4 different types of men who know that they need to rage against the dying of the light. And it's sort of open to interpretation for each man. You have wise men, you have good men, you have wild men, you have grave men. And it's certainly open to interpretation. Well, why is it that they know that they need to rage against the dying of the light? So let's look at wise men. The wise men at their end know dark is right. So a wise person knows, well, this is inevitable. This is the way it has to be. This is right. In the end, it is right. This is the way it must be. Even those wise men, they know it's right. They know that in the end they're going to die, because their words had forked no lightning. Okay, so they don't go gentle into that good night. And well, let's see if we can come up with what that means. Wise men don't want to die because their words had forked no lightning. Kind of hard to know exactly what that means. It's almost pointing to things beyond words. I mean, one way of looking at it is perhaps they wanted their words of wisdom as wise men to have more effect somehow on the world, to catch lightning, to catch fire. But they know that their words haven't, and so they're not ready to go yet. Their words have not yet done what they need to do. They haven't yet released all of their power. Okay? How about good men? The last wave by. Okay, so now we have a sea metaphor. And they're crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. So good men, they do good deeds, right? But maybe when they see against the immensity of a bay, a green bay, an immense green bay, how can frail deeds possibly measure up? And so I think good men, they don't want to die because they are crying because their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Maybe they feel like they haven't done enough good, or the good things they have done haven't yet left their mark, haven't yet helped as many people as possible. And that last wave has passed them by, and now their frail deeds no longer have the power of dancing in a green bay. What about wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late? They grieved it on its way. So wild men, they caught and sang the sun in flight. They caught the sun. Okay, so when I think of wild men here, I think of a person who lives hard and fast, but dies young. This is the kind of person maybe who, the expression is, they burn their candle from both ends. And so they live wild lives, but they don't live long lives. And I think the sun metaphor sort of reinforces that idea. They caught and sang the sun in flight. They caught the sun, and as the sun was flying, they were singing, but then they learned too late. They grieved it on its way. And so maybe this idea of sunrise, sunset, that the sun sets too quickly. They grieved it on its way. They sent the sun on its way too soon. And so these wild men don't live long lives. And then finally, grave men near death. Now, all of the men here in this poem are near death. Grave men, if you are a grave person, it means you're a serious person. Okay, so the last one was about wild men. What about serious people? They can see with their blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. So I think maybe they don't want to die because their blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. I think maybe grave men, very serious people who live their lives very seriously, maybe they didn't experience enough joy in their lives. They could have had more, their eyes could have blazed like more meteors. They could have been more happy, more gay in their lives. And so they rage against the dying of the light. Now, all four of these examples really are it's kind of a take your pick, because ultimately the audience is his father. And you, my father, there on the sad height. So his father's there dying. I imagine he's on a bed, okay? And on the sad height. It's kind of hard to imagine. I don't imagine the bed, way up, way high. But maybe it's a sad height, meaning because it's low. It's not high up. And yet, when we think of our fathers, he's probably thinking of his father, that he's sad because his father is, I guess, laid out and dying. And maybe the word height is because maybe we tend to put our fathers on a pedestal. We look up to them, right? And maybe now at this moment, he's not at such a great height. Maybe he's laid low, okay? And then he says curse, but almost as if he changes his mind. He switches curse to bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. So he's asking his father to cry fierce tears. And of course, you can understand why that would be a curse. Your first reaction would be, oh, don't cry. And so that would feel like a curse with these fierce tears. But then he switches it to bless, inviting us to wonder, well, in what way seeing your father cry near death would that be a blessing? Well, it could be that it's a blessing in as much as it matters to the father that he's dying, and it matters to him that his son is suffering because of it. So he might be saying to his father, prove to me that this matters to you. Prove to me that you know how much I want you to live. Prove to me that you want to live, I pray. And then he gives those two pieces of advice, really the same piece of advice, but for each of the other four men, he just gave half of the piece. Now he gives him the full on. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. So ultimately, this turns out to be very personal for him, doesn't it? It starts out as an argument, a logical argument, and you should fight death, and I'm going to present you with four different types of men. Those are my body paragraphs. Four different types of men. And then, of course, this beautiful figurative language is kind of hard to know. I'm open to all kinds of interpretation of what those mean. I gave you mine, but certainly there are others. Ultimately, here are these four people who, for however we can kind of tease out the meaning of that figurative language, they're all there just to help make the case. Please, Dad, don't just slip off. Don't just die without putting up a fight. Rage against it. And if I see that you're crying fierce tears, even though that would be hurtful, it would be like a curse. It would bless me because it would mean that it meant something to you. Okay, and finally, Peter Meinke's advice to my son. For Tim. The trick is to live your days as if each one may be your last, for they go fast, and young men lose their lives in strange and unimaginable ways. But at the same time, plan long range, for they go slow, If you survive the shattered windshield and the bursting shell, you will arrive at our approximation here below of heaven or hell. To be specific, between the peony and the rose, plant squash and spinach, turnips and tomatoes. Beauty is nectar, and nectar in a desert saves. But the stomach craves stronger sustenance than the honey divine. Therefore, marry a pretty girl after seeing her mother. Speak truth to one man, work with another, and always serve bread with your wine. But son, always serve wine. Okay, so this is advice to his son, and his son, I guess, is named Tim, and it's 1965. So I don't know how old Tim is. My version of Tim is a person who is young enough to still be taking advice from his father, but also old enough for his father to be talking about serving wine. So to me, he's 16. Okay, that's my version of Tim. And in 1965, of course, the Vietnam War was starting to ramp up. And so maybe Peter Meinke, was just thinking, okay, in a couple of years, what's going to become of Tim? Will he get drafted? And so he's giving advice. And I have to say, this is not the most earth-shattering advice ever. Okay. What essentially he is saying is, well, you need a plan, but you need to, make sure you enjoy your life too. So he says the trick is to live your days as if each one may be your last. But you and I can't do that, right? We can't really live each of our lives as if they may be our last. If I believe this were my last day, I don't think I would be here making this recording. But I'm making this recording because I know it's not going to be my last day. And it's not going to be your last day because you're going to be listening to this recording days after I made it. Okay. But he's saying to try to do this, at least to be aware, to try to make each day count, I suppose. For they go fast. Days go fast. And it's kind of harder for a young person, say a 16-year-old, to understand how fast time goes by. And as you get older and older and older, you've probably heard people say, boy, when you get older, time goes by faster and faster and faster. And a day will come when you will say exactly the same thing. When you get older, time seems to go much, much faster. And so he says, they go fast, your days go fast, and young men lose their lives in strange and unimaginable ways. Put that on hold for a minute. What does he mean that young men lose their lives in strange and unimaginable ways? Well, he's going to tell us in a moment, but let's keep going. At the same time, plan long range, for they go slow. So life is fast, but at the same time, it's slow. I've heard the expression before, days are long, but years are short. So depending on how you're living your life, days can go by very slowly. If you're not living a good life, I suppose, days could drag, can't they? So then he says, if you survive the shattered windshield and the bursting shell. Well, he's just told us what are the strange and unimaginable ways that young men lose their lives. Well, the shattered windshield. Car wrecks, they drive recklessly and they kill themselves that way. And the bursting shell. Gunfire, either gunfire at home or perhaps in wars. Those are the two most common ways you can think of, of a young man in 1965 losing his life. Car wreck or being shot. So these are not such strange and unimaginable ways. These are all too common ways that young men die, except, of course, they are strange and unimaginable to him, to the poet, to the father. It would be strange and unimaginable for him to lose Tim in this way. So he says, if you survive these things, if you survive the car wreck, being shot at, you will arrive at our approximation here below of heaven or hell. Okay, so essentially he's saying, if you survive the things that can kill young men, where will you arrive? You will arrive into adulthood. Right? If you survive adolescence, you arrive into adulthood. And what does he call adulthood? Our approximation here below of heaven or hell. This is the degree to which it's one or the other, heaven or hell. I guess a lot of it has to do with how you live your life. But it's not going to be, it's probably for most of us, it's going to be, we're going to have some heavenly days and some hellish days, and we're going to arrive here. Then the next stanza starts with the words, to be specific. It's almost as if he recognizes that the first stanza was sort of vague generalities, almost as if he's trying to find ways of saying something, and they're general, and it's just sort of, hey, you got to live your life to the fullest, but you also need a plan. Otherwise, you don't get anywhere in life. So he says to be specific, and then he lapses into metaphor. Peony and roses. Peony is a type of flower. Okay, so unless Tim is going to be a farmer or something, I don't think he's really talking about peonies and roses and squash and spinach. Okay, so to be specific, but then he lapses into metaphor again. Between the peony and the roses, plant squash and spinach, turnips and tomatoes. Okay, so definitely plant peonies and plant roses, but between them, plant squash and spinach, turnips and tomatoes. So the peony and the rose, they are what bring beauty to our life. Okay, but we can't live just on beauty. So make sure you plant the stuff that you're going to need to eat to survive. Beauty is nectar, and nectar in a desert saves. Let me come back to that one. But the stomach craves stronger sustenance than the honeyed vine. The honeyed vine is sort of poetic language, I suppose, for wine, right? Grapes grow on vines, so the honeyed vine. Okay, so what he's saying is, look, beauty is nectar, and nectar in a desert saves. We need beauty in our lives, and in a desert it saves. But the stomach craves stronger sustenance than the honeyed vine. You can't just live on beauty. You can't just live on the nectar of beauty, the honeyed vine. Therefore, and then here was some sort of random, but much more sort of practical, down-to-earth advice. Marry a pretty girl after seeing her mother. So it seems to me that a lot of this advice comes down to that sort of first advice. Live your day, live your life to the fullest, live each day to the fullest, but also you need to plan long range, right? And so living life to the fullest, that's about roses, right? Smelling the roses. But planning long range, that's about planting spinach and tomatoes. He says, listen, the stomach craves stronger sustenance, stronger substance, stronger food that keeps your body going than the honeyed vine. Therefore, marry a pretty girl. Well, if we were to say, look, marrying a pretty girl, is that kind of on the rose side of the scale, or is that more on the squash and turnips side of the scale? Well, that's on the beauty is nectar side, right? That's on the rose side. Marry a pretty girl after seeing her mother. Okay. I think what that means is that who is she? Who are her people? And not just what does her mother look like now, okay? But this pretty girl you're going to marry, just like the handsome, maybe Tim's a handsome guy, that pretty and handsome isn't going to last forever. So what's going to remain after that? What's her mother like? What are her people like? So check out her people, due diligence. It'll give you an indication perhaps of who this woman will become. Pretty girl is like a rose, but what's going to provide him with long-term sustenance? What does his heart really need long-term? Well, check out the mother and find out if she's providing sustenance, okay? So, pretty girl, roses, seeing the mother, spinach and tomatoes, right? Speak truth to one man, work with another. Speaking truth to one man, we need that person in our lives who, in this case, speak truth to one man. So we're not talking about, we're probably talking about like a buddy, right? A friend. We need that one person in our lives that we can say anything to. We can speak the truth to. This person we don't feel will ever judge us, will ever reject us. We can speak truth to this person. But then he says, work with another. So that person you could say anything to. Don't work with that person. If you have a buddy at work, don't make that person your best friend, okay? Because we need to keep separate. What makes life worth living? What brings beauty to our lives? Well, it's roses, and it's nectar, and it's pretty girls, and it's having a person you can speak the truth to, okay? But what if you and that other person are up for the same promotion, right? Maybe don't work with that person. The person who you can say anything to and open your heart to, don't work with that person. You go to work to earn your your spinach and your turnips and your tomatoes, your sustenance. You don't go to work for roses. Okay, you go to work to feed yourself, right? And then finally he says, and always serve bread with your wine. Okay, so I think that this is pretty clear. Bread is what your body needs for sustenance, and wine is more like the roses. It's like the beauty, right? So we need to have what sustains us, planning long range, and living our days to the fullest. That's the wine. So everything in this poem sort of breaks down to, all right, is it about living your days to the fullest? Is it about roses? Is it about nectar? Is it about pretty girl? Is it about speaking truth to one man? Is it about wine? Finding a balance between those things and things which sustain you. Okay, planning long range, spinach and turnips, seeing her mother, work with a person who you don't speak absolute truth to. And finally, bread with wine. And then this last little piece here, but son, always serve wine. So what's kind of interesting to me, he knows Tim better than you and I know Tim. And maybe Tim is more the spinach and tomatoes type. And he's saying, the thing I'm worried about you, Tim, is maybe you're going to forget the part about the wine. Maybe you'll remember the bread part, but you'll forget the wine part. But he also might be saying, if you cannot achieve a perfect balance, then have the balance tipped in favor of the things which make your life worth living, the beauty, living each day to its last. Okay? Now, if my dad were giving this advice, he would have said, no, you need a plan. It's nice to stop and smell the roses. It's nice to serve wine, but bread is more important than wine. Peter Meinke is saying, no, maybe the things which make life worth living are more important than the things that make it possible to live. I want to go back to the line, beauty is nectar, and nectar in a desert saves, only because it sounds sort of counterintuitive. Because remember, we're breaking things down into either roses or spinach. And he says, beauty is nectar. Okay, so beauty is nectar. Beauty is like this very sweet drink. And nectar in a desert saves. Okay, if I'm in a desert, I want water, but I also want nourishment, right? I want sustenance. I don't want beauty. I don't want to be dying of thirst, dying of hunger in a desert and saying, but isn't it beautiful to look at this desertscape? I don't want that. So it's really interesting. So beauty is nectar, and nectar in a desert saves. So that means A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C, right? That beauty saves in a desert. Beauty saves in a desert. And so it makes me wonder, well, what kind of desert are we talking about in which you don't need food, you need beauty? And that to me, I think, is the desert of the soul. Those times when maybe dark moments of the soul, where what we need is not what the body needs. What we need is what the soul needs. And the soul needs beauty. And the soul needs a reason to live our lives fully. All right, but I love it. It's a beautiful poem. And this poem, at least, wasn't specifically about death. It was about how to live life. Okay? All right, that's all for now. Don't forget to do the quiz. Take care. Bye now.